As we continue to look at the evidence for evolution, now we want to take a look at anatomical features. So there's some similarities and differences that you see among organisms that are related to each other. So the first type of structure that we want to talk about are homologous structures. These are structures that are similar because they came from a common ancestor. And so these, if we look at the different pictures we see here, we're looking at a human arm, we have a cat's leg or front legs, we have a whale's flipper, a bat's wing. And if you look at the shading and the colors of the bones, you can see that there are similar bones in all of these structures. Now, obviously, we don't have exactly the same size and shape to these bones anymore, and you have more of some of them, such as whale. We've got lots of phalanges in the whale. But they're very similar, but the different structures now have a different role inside the organism. So one is a flipper, it's used for swimming. The bat is going to use that for flying. And then we've got the arm, we've got the leg for walking, and the cat. So there's a lot of homologous structures that you can see if you actually look at organisms and their anatomy. We also have what are called vestigial structures. So vestigial structures are basically structures that have lost their function. So these are things that don't function anymore. And one example of this would be if you actually look at a snake's skeleton. The snake skeleton actually has a region where the pelvis would have had leg bones attached to it. So this would be similar to what we have in a lizard, except the snake doesn't need the legs anymore. So you don't actually have the legs there, but there's some remnants of it. That's what we would call a vestigial structure. The appendix in humans would be another one. We don't know of a function for the appendix, and many people do have problems with the appendix, and they do have it taken out. So that would be what we would also call a vestigial structure. It's a structure that may have had function in our earlier ancestor, but at this point, it has lost its function, at least in humans. We can also see a lot of similarities when we look at development. So if we look at early embryo development, if we compare a reptile, bird, pig, human, if you look at these pictures here, they're very similar to each other when we look early in development. All of them have a tail, so even the human embryo has a tail present in it. All of them have gills. Now, in a fish, those may develop into what we know of as gills now. In humans, those develop more into ear structures. But we do want to be aware of the fact that if you look, there are similarities there. There's more similarities present than what a lot of people realize. If we talk about cellular structures, cells are very similar. And if you took Bio 1, then you should remember that animal cells all have pretty much the same parts to them, whether we're talking about a human cell, a dog cell, and we can compare those with plant cells as well, and the plant cells are going to be very similar. There's a few differences there, but just for example, if we're talking about energy production, the mitochondria is involved in energy production. That doesn't matter whether you're talking about a cat, a mushroom, a pine tree, they're all going to use a mitochondria for energy production. All cells have a plasma membrane. That plasma membrane is made up of essentially the same thing. It's a phospholipid bilayer. All cells have water-based cytoplasm. Lots of similarities. They have a similar cell division process. So mitosis is very similar in the two. We could also talk about hereditary information. So when we talk about hereditary information, we're talking about DNA. DNA is going to be made up of nucleotides, regardless of which organism we're talking about. And this would apply to all organisms that we know of. So we have basically 4 bases. We have A, T, C, and G. The base pairing is going to be exactly the same in every organism, at least all organisms that we know to date. And there's a lot of similarities when we just compare organisms that might seem quite different from each other. So when we compare a frog to a human, or when we compare a bacterial cell to a human, there's a lot of proteins in a frog, in a human, in a bacteria that actually are very similar to each other and may perform exactly the same function. So when we combine all of this kind of information together, all of these similarities, it causes us to think that yes, there is a very good chance that these did evolve from a common ancestor at some point in time. Okay, so there's more evidence that lends itself towards that common ancestor than there is against it. There are certainly differences with regards to cell structure, anatomy, DNA sequences, but that would be the changes that take place over time with each generation in response to that interaction with the environment. If we look at this picture here, so this evolutionary tree, we can see all of the common ancestors kind of marked out for us. So the branching points in the tree. So here we have what we call tetrapods. And so that would be amphibians, mammals, lizards, snakes, birds. And these all do have a common ancestor. So if you look here, what would be the common ancestor of the tetrapods? Just to see if you can read this evolutionary tree. The common ancestor of the tetrapods would be right here at number 2. Okay, so number 2 is indicating that common ancestor. Notice that it was very long ago. So we have that common ancestor for the tetrapods, and then there were some differences that took place, and we begin to get some different organisms, what we see as different organisms today. One thing that you can tell from the evolutionary tree, besides the common ancestors, is that we can also get a sense of evolutionary time. So as we go across this tree, as we proceed in this direction, we're beginning to get more recent. And back this way is more in the past. Okay, so if we have a great distance between one side of the tree and the next, we can see that that's been a longer period of time. And another way to look at it is if we look here, the ostriches and the hawks and other birds, they diverged from each other a lot more recently than, say, the, we'll say amphibians and mammals. So for them, amphibians and mammals, this would be their most common ancestor. If we switch pace a little bit and we talk about analogous structures are not evidence of evolution. So these analogous structures are basically just coincidental. So you can think of these as coincidence. The sugar glider that comes from Australia looks in a lot of ways to be very similar to the flying squirrel that we have in North America. They both have flaps on the sides of their body that run from their front legs to their back legs, and they both use these for gliding. So you might think that these two organisms are very closely related to each other. They're actually very different from each other. They just happen to occupy similar niches in their habitat. So both of them live up in trees. Both of them do jump or glide from one tree to another. And so over time, natural selection has selected for the same characteristics. Basically, big flaps of skin on the sides of their bodies has been advantageous. So those organisms that had that were the ones that were successful in their survival and then their reproduction and contribution to the next generation. So not all structures that look the same in two different organisms can be considered homologous. Homologous structures would be structures that are due to having a common ancestor that had that structure also, whereas analogous structures evolved independently, and just by coincidence, these structures happen to look the same and maybe play the same role or function in these various organisms. If we talk about biogeography, biogeography has to do with how organisms that live in close proximity to each other tend to be similar to each other, and they evolved from more recent common ancestors. So keep in mind that the land masses that we have on the Earth's surface used to all be one large landmass. And over time, millions of years ago, these began to break apart and separate from each other and form the continents that we're now familiar with today. So if you consider this, If you have an organism that evolved very early on, notice that, say, these land masses are connected to each other. So you would expect that some of the organisms on those connecting pieces might be very similar to each other, may have similar ancestry. And then over time, the ones that have been more separated from each other, you're going to see have less similarity with each other. Those land masses that are not connected at all, those are going to have organisms that are quite a lot different from the continents and the land masses that were connected. So if we look at an example of this, in the middle of this diagram, you can see that we had South America, Africa, Antarctica, India, Australia. All of these places were connected at one time very closely to each other. So in places where they weren't actually connected, we had very small parts of water between them. If you look at this salamander, or these very closely related similar organisms here, notice that you find them in places that were connected together. So if we just look at say the top one there that's shown in yellow, you have a continuous range that it's found between South America and Africa. If we look at the one that's shown in blue, again, it's a continuous range. So notice it's not just a random spreading of the organism all over the place, but we can actually look at where the organism is present or where we might find it in the fossil record, and we can relate that to the connection of the continents together at one point in time. So when all is said and done, as we get through this first chapter, evolution can be summarized in two main points. We have a lot of different life forms here on the Earth's surface, and this diversity of life that we have around us has arisen through descent with modification from an ancestral species. Now, the process or the mode of action for all of this to take place is natural selection. So natural selection is the mechanism for descent with modification, as Darwin called it, and it's been at work for an enormous period of time. So we are not in any way saying that these are fast changes that are going to take place. These may take hundreds, thousands, millions of years, so very slow changes, but we've had a lot of change, or a lot of time for change, when we look at the Earth's history. So this is the basis of evolution. We also want to keep in mind, as we move into the next chapter, that evolution and natural selection, this is an interaction with the environment, and as the environment always changes, this is going to change from time to time. Which characteristics would be advantageous and which ones would not be so beneficial for the organism. We also want to keep in mind that it is the population that is evolving and changing. We don't have an individual's heritable characteristics changing from, say, their birth until their time of production of offspring. So it is a population that's evolving or changing in response to natural selection, not an individual.